Hi everyone, Smarty began, her voice calm yet full of an unshakable fire. Before we dive into this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Welcome to Black Queen Dominion, where queens rise, voices are heard, and revenge is served in style. From the very beginning, Smarty's life had been underestimated. Growing up in a neighborhood where dreams were measured in modest paychecks and survival, she learned early that no one would hand her success. Her husband, at the time a man she thought she could trust, seemed to see her ambition as an amusement. He often laughed when she spoke of her goals, his words slicing with precision, "Stay in your lane." That phrase became the echo in her mind every time she dared to envision a life beyond the confines he had unconsciously, or perhaps intentionally, drawn around her. Smarty wasn't a woman who could be easily broken. The laughter, the dismissals, the condescending remarks, these were fuel for a fire he would never expect. She had watched him rise in the corporate world, climbed the ladder through connections she had no access to, while she was expected to smile quietly, content with the domestic roles society had drafted for her. But she had a plan, one that had been quietly forming behind polite smiles and nods, unnoticed emails, and evening hours spent learning every facet of business he thought he could hide from her. The morning he mocked her latest idea, claiming it was too ambitious for a woman like her, she nodded as if accepting his verdict. But when she lay in bed that night, she didn't sleep. Instead, she strategized. She visualized herself not as the woman seated beside him at social gatherings, polite and underestimated, but as a force in the very boardrooms he dominated. She opened her laptop and started her nightly ritual: emails, research, networking. Every interaction was deliberate, every conversation a seed planted for a future harvest he could never foresee. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and Smarty became a ghost in his life, silent, almost invisible. But her presence in the professional world was growing, tangible and formidable. She built alliances with key stakeholders, offered insightful advice on projects he led, and cultivated a reputation as a woman whose judgment was not only sound but often indispensable. While he laughed at office gossip, dismissing her influence, she quietly secured her place in the ecosystem of the company he thought he owned. She mastered languages of finance, strategy, and negotiation. She understood market trends better than many of the board members he trusted. Smarty became the quiet pulse behind initiatives, the shadow advisor who whispered solutions in ears that mattered. No one suspected the domestic, underestimated woman was slowly becoming the architect of her own ascent. Meanwhile, at home he continued to belittle her. He wore arrogance like armor, never questioning that she was nothing more than an accessory to his success. Smarty observed him, cataloging his weaknesses, recognizing where arrogance blinded him and where greed made him predictable. She learned the rhythm of his days, the patterns of his thinking, and the gaps in his decision-making that she could exploit when the time was right. But it wasn't all strategy and numbers. Smarty's rise was also built on resilience, on understanding human nature, and on empathy that allowed her to connect with people authentically. Colleagues who had dismissed her soon found themselves seeking her insight, trusting her advice, and relying on her judgment. Every compliment she received, every nod of approval from influential figures, was a silent victory over the man who thought her ambition was laughable. She didn't boast, she didn't gloat, because the strongest power is often quiet. Smarty knew that revenge, in its most potent form, is patience wrapped in brilliance. Each night as he slept, unaware of the empire she was quietly building, she moved closer to the moment when laughter would no longer be on his side. The turning point came unexpectedly. A board meeting called at the 11th hour, supposedly routine, became the stage for Smarty's unveiling. Invitations had gone out, names finalized, agendas set, but what no one anticipated was the email she had sent to key board members weeks earlier, presenting herself as a candidate for a crucial role that would redefine leadership within the company. She had researched the company's structure, identified gaps in management, and prepared a vision statement so compelling that even the most skeptical executives couldn't deny her capability. Smarty walked into that meeting, composed, elegant, her demeanor calm but radiating authority. The room, filled with familiar faces, suddenly felt like a theater of anticipation. She spoke confidently, articulating strategies that resonated with both logic and vision. Board members who had once ignored her now leaned in, captivated by the clarity of her mind and the depth of her insight. The man who had mocked her husband, watched silently, his smirk fading into disbelief. By the time the meeting adjourned, the air was charged with a new reality. Offers were on the table, discussions had shifted, and whispers of admiration began circulating, quietly, deliberately. Smarty didn't react immediately. She had learned that patience amplifies impact. She allowed the anticipation to build, knowing the moment of triumph must be crafted with precision. As she returned home that evening, she carried herself differently. She didn't announce her victory, didn't gloat, but her presence was undeniable. The man who had once laughed at her ambition now confronted a reality he had never imagined. A wife who was no longer confined to his expectations, a woman who had quietly become more powerful than he could comprehend. And so the stage was set. The next morning would bring revelations that would shake the foundations of the life he thought he controlled. Smarty had prepared meticulously, and the world and her husband were about to witness the rise of a queen who had always been underestimated. The morning sunlight spilled across the city like liquid gold, illuminating a world that was about to shift irrevocably. Smarty woke before dawn, her mind already racing through the steps of the day she had meticulously orchestrated. While her husband had drifted off to sleep with the smug satisfaction of assumed dominance, she had worked tirelessly, polishing every detail that would ensure her ascent was undeniable. Today was the day the empire he thought he controlled would realize that she had quietly become its heartbeat. Her first move was subtle but strategic. She arrived at the company headquarters ahead of anyone else, not to announce her intentions, but to allow the energy of the place to settle around her. The air carried the faint hum of anticipation, though no one knew why. Executives whispered among themselves, unaware that the woman they had overlooked for years had spent countless nights building the exact credibility, relationships, and knowledge that would place her above them all. Emails that had been sent weeks prior began to pay dividends. Several board members arrived with a different mindset, intrigued by the comprehensive proposals Smarty had submitted. They had spent hours reviewing her strategies, analyzing her projections, and understanding the depth of her vision. It was no longer a question of whether she was capable. The only question remaining was how quickly she would reshape the company. As the board convened, Smarty entered with quiet confidence, carrying no briefcase, no flashy presentation. Only her intellect, her poise, and the silent authority she had cultivated over months of meticulous preparation. The room fell into a subtle hush. She wasn't there to beg or plead. She was there to demonstrate that the position she now sought was not only her right but a necessary evolution for the company's growth. Her husband arrived last, unaware that this day would redefine his understanding of her entirely. He walked in expecting normalcy, expecting the familiar dance of power he had performed for years. But as he glanced across the boardroom, his eyes met hers, and the first flicker of uncertainty passed through him. There was no fear, only a calm that spoke louder than words. A quiet storm gathering strength, a presence he could not intimidate. Smarty began her presentation. Each point was precise, backed by data, market trends, and actionable strategies. Every sentence was infused with the authority of someone who not only understood the company but also envisioned its future in ways no one else had dared. She addressed challenges he had ignored, risks he had underestimated, and opportunities he had never seen. The executives listened intently, many leaning forward, captivated by the clarity and innovation in her proposals. As she spoke, she observed her husband carefully. His confidence, once unshakable, wavered subtly. He tried to interject, to assert dominance, but the room had shifted. Board members no longer deferred to him automatically. Their attention was on Smarty. Their nods, their notes, their quiet murmurs of agreement, all signaled that a new order was emerging. By the time she concluded, the room was silent, charged with anticipation. No one clapped, no one cheered, because this was not entertainment. This was recognition of power that had long been ignored. The board convened in private to deliberate, and in those hushed discussions, Smarty's name emerged repeatedly, her vision praised, her competence undeniable. It was not just her ideas. They were ideas that could transform the company, protect its legacy, and expand its influence. Meanwhile, her husband sat frozen, the reality settling like a weight he could not lift. The man who had laughed at her, mocked her dreams, and assumed her loyalty without ambition was now confronted with a truth he had never anticipated. She was no longer his subordinate, no longer confined to his definitions of success. She had become the architect of her own destiny, and the company that had once elevated him would now bear witness to her rise. The announcement came quietly but decisively. The board, unanimous in their decision, appointed Smarty as the new CEO. It was not a spectacle, not a humiliation. It was simply the recognition of excellence, of preparation, and of brilliance that had always existed but had been ignored. News spread quickly through the company, whispers turning to conversations, conversations to astonishment. Employees who had dismissed her now looked to her for leadership, realizing that the very person they had underestimated had quietly built an empire within an empire. At home, her husband's world began to unravel in subtle ways. His interactions, once laced with control and derision, now carried hesitation. Colleagues who had respected him now sought her approval, subtly shifting loyalty and influence to the woman he had once mocked. He tried to maintain composure, but every meeting, every conversation, reminded him that the rules had changed. The queen had claimed her throne, and he was no longer the center of power. Smarty, however, remained composed. She did not gloat, she did not revel in his discomfort. Her victory was quiet but complete, a testament to patience, strategy, and relentless determination. She understood that true power is not about tearing someone down publicly. It is about rising above, commanding respect, and redefining expectations. Every decision she made, every policy she implemented, subtly reshaped the company culture, establishing a legacy that would endure long after personal grievances faded. Even as she settled into her new role, Smarty continued to observe, to strategize, to refine her influence. She knew that power is never static, that those who underestimate can become threats again. But she also knew that her approach, calculated, deliberate, and relentless, ensured that her rise was not just a fleeting triumph, but a permanent transformation. Her husband, once arrogant and dismissive, now watched as she navigated board meetings, investor calls, and company strategy with an ease that belied the months of preparation he had ignored. Every decision, every command, every strategic move reinforced the reality he could not deny. She was the leader, the visionary, the force that could no longer be overlooked. And so the shift was complete. Smarty had claimed not only her position but the respect, loyalty, and admiration of those around her. Her husband, once the architect of her limitations, was now confronted with a truth he could neither ignore nor reverse. The empire he thought was his had been transformed, quietly and irrevocably, by the very woman he had dismissed. The day ended with a calm that was almost surreal. Smarty returned home not to celebrate with fanfare, but to reflect on the journey that had brought her here. She had faced doubt, mockery, and underestimation at every turn, but she had leveraged every obstacle into an opportunity. She had built relationships, mastered skills, and cultivated influence that no one, not even her husband, could ever take away. The stage was set for the next chapter of her life, one where every decision, every move, and every revelation would further assert her authority. The empire had shifted, and she, Smarty, was the undeniable queen at its center. The weeks following Smarty's appointment as CEO were a revelation for everyone in the company. The walls that had once echoed with her husband's arrogance now resonated with her decisive steps and confident presence. Every corridor she walked, every meeting she led, carried the aura of someone who was no longer underestimated. While the board had formally recognized her as the head, it was her subtle actions that cemented her authority. She understood that true power is not in the title alone, but in influence, perception, and the ability to inspire loyalty. From the moment she stepped into the role, Smarty implemented changes with precision. She began by assessing the company's structure, identifying inefficiencies, redundancies, and untapped potential. Each department underwent subtle recalibration, aligning talent with strategy in ways that maximized productivity and innovation. Employees who had once doubted her now found themselves following her lead with enthusiasm, recognizing that her insight was not just theoretical but actionable. Her husband, meanwhile, struggled to reconcile the shift in dynamics. He had assumed his influence would endure because of his tenure and connections, but Smarty had already anticipated every move. She communicated with the board strategically, secured key allies, and delegated responsibilities in a way that reinforced her vision. Every decision was deliberate, calculated to strengthen her position while quietly undermining his assumptions of dominance. Beyond internal restructuring, Smarty focused on cultivating relationships outside the company. Investors, industry leaders, and partners who had once favored her husband now approached her directly, recognizing the clarity and ambition of her leadership. She spoke with authority, her vision for growth compelling and grounded in both intelligence and strategy. Where her husband had relied on charm and connections, she relied on results, foresight, and undeniable competence. As the company began to thrive under her leadership, the contrast between her and her husband became stark. Employees who had once admired his confidence now noticed the hesitation in his decisions. Meetings he led felt uncertain, his directives often questioned, while Smarty's initiatives moved forward seamlessly. It was not public humiliation, but a quiet, relentless assertion of capability that left a lasting impression. Smarty's rise was also personal. She had learned that leadership is as much about perception as it is about action. She carefully curated her image, balancing elegance, authority, and approachability. Her presence in meetings, in public events, and even in casual encounters communicated that she was in control. Her husband, by contrast, seemed increasingly out of step, unaware that the woman he had once dismissed was now the center of every critical decision. She also cultivated loyalty through recognition and empowerment. Employees who had previously felt undervalued found in her a leader who saw potential and nurtured it. Managers who had once overlooked her contributions now became her allies, inspired by her ability to balance authority with support. This network of loyalty became an invisible web of influence, further solidifying her position and extending her reach beyond the formal structure of the company. In her personal life, Smarty's husband attempted to reclaim his sense of control, but every gesture, every comment, was met with calm, unshakable confidence. She no longer sought validation from him. Her achievements were independent, undeniable, and transformative. He realized, perhaps too late, that the laughter he had directed at her dreams had only fueled her determination. The very woman he had mocked now commanded the empire he thought was his birthright. Smarty also began to redefine the company culture. She emphasized innovation, inclusivity, and accountability, establishing policies that reflected her vision for sustainable growth. Employees responded positively, embracing the clarity of expectations and the opportunity to contribute meaningfully. Under her leadership, the company's performance metrics improved significantly, further demonstrating that her rise was not superficial but rooted in tangible results. The media began to take notice. Industry publications highlighted the company's transformation, praising the leadership of a woman who had not only assumed the role of CEO but had immediately demonstrated its worth. Articles lauded her strategic acumen, her ability to inspire teams, and her commitment to long-term success. Everywhere she went, Smarty's reputation grew, cementing her status as a force to be reckoned with. Her husband, however, struggled privately with his diminishing influence. The contrast between his past authority and the current reality gnawed at him. Colleagues who once deferred to his opinions now sought her guidance first. His attempts to assert control were increasingly ignored or politely redirected. The quiet shift in power was undeniable, and he could feel the walls closing in, though he could not articulate why. Smarty understood the psychological aspect of her ascent. She allowed him moments of perceived authority, creating an illusion of influence while maintaining control. Every suggestion he made, every initiative he attempted to spearhead, was subtly aligned with her broader vision, ensuring that the company advanced according to her strategy. She had mastered the art of indirect power, leading without overt confrontation, winning without unnecessary conflict. The culmination of her efforts began to show in measurable success. Revenue increased, employee satisfaction rose, and investor confidence strengthened. Smarty's leadership style, decisive yet empathetic, strategic yet approachable, was transforming the company into a model of excellence. And through it all she remained poised, never overtly reveling in her husband's diminishing influence, allowing the narrative of her triumph to unfold naturally. At home, the tension between them was palpable. He had underestimated her, dismissed her capabilities, and assumed his position was secure. Now he watched as she moved through life with quiet authority, her accomplishments speaking louder than any confrontation he could engineer. His laughter, once a tool of control, had no place in a world where Smarty's competence and vision had already spoken. Smarty's journey was far from over, but she had established the foundation of dominance. Her ascent was not just a personal victory, it was a statement, a testament to resilience, strategy, and the power of relentless ambition. She had transformed every insult, every dismissal into motivation, and her empire had become a reflection of her strength. As the chapter closed, the company had been irrevocably changed. Smarty had solidified her influence, expanded her reach, and redefined what leadership meant in a space that had once tried to confine her. Her husband's realization of his diminished role was only beginning, and the coming weeks would reveal the full extent of the transformation she had quietly engineered. The shift in power was no longer subtle. Smarty had become the undeniable force at the heart of the company, and every day revealed the stark contrast between her vision and her husband's once dominant presence. Internally, she had reshaped hierarchies, strengthened alliances, and created a culture where loyalty was earned through competence, not fear or charm. Externally, her influence rippled across the industry, leaving competitors and partners alike astonished at the clarity and effectiveness of her leadership. Her husband, once confident and untouchable, now navigated a landscape that he no longer controlled. He moved through the office with cautious steps, aware that each decision he attempted to assert was subtly redirected or outshone by Smarty's initiatives. Colleagues who had once followed him unquestioningly now deferred to her, seeking her approval and insight. Even clients who had favored his authority now looked to her for direction, validating the quiet power she had cultivated. Smarty observed all of this with a calm precision that masked the intensity of her strategic mind. She knew that true dominance is not demonstrated through confrontation alone. It is solidified through consistent competence, quiet influence, and an unassailable reputation. Every meeting she led, every decision she executed, reinforced the reality that she was no longer just part of the system. She had become the system's architect. Her husband attempted to push back, hoping to reclaim some semblance of authority. He issued directives, questioned decisions, and tried to assert his knowledge of the company's inner workings. But Smarty had anticipated each move. She had positioned herself so thoroughly within the board, among senior executives, and across strategic partnerships that his attempts to influence outcomes were either absorbed into her plans or subtly neutralized. Each failure he experienced chipped away at his credibility, further enhancing her unchallenged authority. It wasn't only about the company, it was about perception. Smarty understood that public narrative is a powerful weapon. Investors and stakeholders were attuned to the results of her leadership, not the ego of a former CEO who had underestimated her. Media coverage, initially tentative, became glowing, highlighting her strategic insight, her transformative influence, and her ability to lead with clarity and purpose. Her husband's name, once synonymous with the company's success, now faded in relevance compared to the queen who had claimed the helm. Internally, Smarty's leadership style created a shift that went beyond mere compliance. Employees felt empowered, respected, and motivated. Departments previously siloed now collaborated with unprecedented efficiency. Projects that had languished under indecision flourished under her guidance. The company's performance metrics soared, reinforcing the undeniable truth. Smarty's rise was not accidental, nor was it temporary. It was a manifestation of relentless determination, intelligence, and strategic brilliance. At home, the dynamic between them had irrevocably changed. Her husband, once dismissive and controlling, now faced a reality that challenged his very identity. The man who had mocked her ambitions, who had belittled her intelligence, now watched in silence as his wife effortlessly orchestrated the empire he had believed was his domain. The power that had once been his defining trait was now overshadowed by her presence, her competence, and her vision. Smarty, however, maintained a composed exterior. She did not gloat, she did not publicly shame him, for she knew the power of restraint. Instead, she allowed the world, and him, to recognize the truth organically. Her influence extended beyond the boardroom. It seeped into every interaction, every decision, every expectation. She became the reference point for excellence, the standard by which all others were measured. Yet she also understood the psychological dimensions of her victory. Her husband's pride and ego, though wounded, remained a potential challenge. Smarty navigated this with deliberate care, allowing him moments of perceived influence while ensuring that the company's direction remained entirely in her control. Every conversation, every meeting, every public appearance was carefully orchestrated to reinforce her authority while neutralizing any threat of interference. The culmination of these weeks of maneuvering arrived at a critical board event, an annual strategic meeting where the company's future direction would be outlined publicly to stakeholders, investors, and media representatives. Smarty prepared meticulously, ensuring that every presentation, every report, and every projection reflected the clarity, intelligence, and vision she had cultivated. This was not just a demonstration of competence. It was a public declaration of her leadership, an undeniable statement that she was now the force driving the company forward. Her husband attended the event, attempting to assert relevance, yet every word he spoke was overshadowed by her confidence and insight. Smarty presented with authority, navigating questions and challenges with grace, precision, and undeniable expertise. Board members, investors, and attendees watched as the woman they had once underestimated articulated a vision that was clear, ambitious, and actionable. Her husband's presence felt almost ceremonial, a reminder of a past that no longer defined the present. By the conclusion of the event, the company's trajectory had been redefined. Stakeholders left with renewed confidence in the leadership, employees felt inspired and secure in their roles, and her husband faced a reality he could no longer manipulate or control. Smarty's ascent had not only transformed her life but had reshaped the very ecosystem of influence, perception, and power around her. As the evening drew to a close, Smarty returned home with a quiet satisfaction. She had achieved not only professional dominance but also personal vindication. The man who had once laughed at her dreams now confronted the truth of her brilliance, her capability, and her unassailable authority. She had risen not with anger but with intelligence, strategy, and patience, turning every insult, every dismissal into a stepping stone for triumph. The final stage of her journey was approaching. The company, the world, and her husband would soon witness the full extent of her dominance. Every move she had made, every relationship she had cultivated, and every skill she had honed had led to this moment. A queen underestimated for too long, now fully in control of the empire she had always deserved. The dawn of a new era had arrived. Smarty moved through her world with the poise and authority of someone who had finally claimed everything she was always meant to have. The company thrived under her leadership. Every metric reflected her vision, every decision reinforced her authority, and every relationship she had cultivated over months of quiet work now positioned her as an unstoppable force. The empire her husband had assumed belonged to him was now fully and undeniably hers. In the boardroom she commanded respect effortlessly. Executives deferred to her judgment, employees sought her guidance, and investors recognized the wisdom of placing their trust in her hands. Her husband, once a figure of unquestioned dominance, now lingered on the periphery, a shadow of his former authority. He had attempted to assert control, but every move had been anticipated, every argument neutralized. The queen had risen and he could do nothing but witness the transformation. Smarty's triumph was not just professional, it was deeply personal. She had endured mockery, belittlement, and doubt, all while maintaining grace and patience. Every insult, every attempt to keep her in her lane, had become fuel for a meticulously constructed ascent. She had built an empire within an empire, cultivated influence, and proven, without theatrics or humiliation, that she was more capable, strategic, and visionary than anyone, including her husband, could ever imagine. The moment of ultimate vindication came quietly but powerfully. At a company gala celebrating record growth, Smarty was formally recognized by the board and industry leaders as a transformative CEO. A leader whose brilliance had propelled the company to unprecedented heights. Awards, accolades, and media attention followed, but Smarty accepted them with the calm dignity of someone who knew her worth. She didn't boast, she simply stood as proof that perseverance, intelligence, and strategy triumph over arrogance and underestimation. Her husband, attending the gala, could no longer hide the realization that he had been wrong. The laughter he once directed at her ambitions had turned inward. A bitter reminder that the woman he dismissed had quietly and systematically outperformed him at every turn. His presence, once commanding, now felt almost ceremonial, a witness to the success he had never anticipated and could no longer influence. Smarty had mastered the art of quiet power. She had transformed every setback into strategy, every insult into motivation, and every doubt into preparation. The empire that had once defined her husband's identity now reflected her vision, her values, and her uncompromising drive. Employees and stakeholders alike recognized her authority, and the culture of the company shifted permanently under her influence. Where fear had once dominated, respect now thrived. Where arrogance had once led, competence now commanded. But Smarty's victory extended beyond the company walls. She had reshaped her personal narrative, reclaiming her self-worth and her identity. The man who had once tried to confine her to a role of subservience now understood, though perhaps too late, that ambition and brilliance cannot be restrained by others' narrow expectations. Her rise was not just about professional dominance. It was about the reclamation of dignity, the assertion of power, and the transformation of every limitation into a stepping stone toward success. In the weeks following the gala, the full impact of her leadership became undeniable. The company's growth continued, rival firms sought her insights, and the media hailed her as a visionary force. Employees who had once doubted her embraced her vision, collaborators trusted her implicitly, and investors recognized that the queen at the helm was not a fleeting phenomenon but a permanent fixture. Her husband, once the symbol of control and authority, had been relegated to a spectator in the very world he thought defined him. His influence diminished, his ego wounded, and his assumptions shattered. He could only observe as the woman he had underestimated orchestrated the future. Every decision she made, every initiative she championed reinforced the truth. She was the architect of success, the strategist of power, and the queen of an empire she had built with intelligence, resilience, and unshakable determination. Smarty never needed to confront him directly or publicly humiliate him. Her victory was complete in its subtlety, visible in results, acknowledged by peers, and felt in the shifting dynamics of authority. The empire was hers not through theatrics or revenge, but through mastery, vision, and the relentless pursuit of excellence. Every action, every decision, and every relationship she had cultivated contributed to a reality her husband could no longer deny. By the time the sun set over the city skyline, casting a golden glow across the headquarters she now fully commanded, Smarty reflected on the journey. She had endured doubt, mockery, and dismissal, yet emerged stronger, more powerful, and more respected than she had ever imagined. Her rise was not an accident. It was a testament to patience, strategy, and the unyielding belief that no one else defines your limits. And so, the story closed with a queen firmly seated on her throne, an empire thriving under her leadership, and a world finally recognizing her brilliance. Her husband, once a symbol of power and dominance, now understood that the woman he had underestimated had always been capable of greatness. He had simply failed to see it. Smarty's journey was a lesson in resilience, intelligence, and the art of quiet, unstoppable ascension. The empire belonged to her. The respect belonged to her. The victory belonged to her. And most importantly, the life she had always dreamed of, built on her ambition, skill, and unwavering determination, was finally hers, fully and completely.